Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Charles Green and I'm going to be your host today. I'm part of the marketing team here at Bellatrix Software. And firstly, I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's webinar, where we're going to be examining the world of blockchain. But here we're going to look at blockchain less from the perspective of the underlying technology and rather on the practical business implications that organizations need to be aware of. But just before we get started, just very briefly about who we are at Bellatrix. We're one of the fastest growing software development companies in Latin America, and we work with a large number of organizations in the US. But we're actually a bit of a different type of outsourcing company in that we provide what we call innovation services on demand to help companies create great digital products and experiences. And we have delivery centers in Argentina, Peru, where I'm sitting today, and Colombia. But as I said, the vast majority of our customers are based in the US. And to help us understand blockchain in greater detail today, I'm delighted to be joined by independent blockchain consultant Tim Myers. Tim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hello, everybody. And as Charles mentioned, I'm a consultant advising all levels of companies in the area of business design based upon blockchain. So I know we're gonna talk a lot about that today, but it's nice to be on. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And just before we get started, I want to mention briefly today that the session today will be very open. So while we're going to be talking and discussing for much of the next 25 to 30 minutes, please feel free to ask us questions. And you can do that either via the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen or via Twitter. And we're going to be live tweeting throughout using the hashtag blockchainBSF. And also, firstly, thank you very much to everyone who registered today and left their questions on the registration form. We'll be getting to some of those questions during the course of the discussion. But without further ado, I want to kind of kick off the discussion by asking you, Tim, many analysts and commentators consider that blockchain is really on a par with the development of the internet. Are they right?
Absolutely. So I would say that if you look at blockchain in its current timing, it's akin to the very, very early days of the internet, and a lot of people draw the parallels between the two in terms of the ability to change the way we look at the world and for parties to interact. I would say, just as a kind of setting the stage for further discussions today, the internet was really about information and information democratization, and blockchain is about value democratization. So that fundamentally different in the terms of how it's going to affect businesses and the exchange of value, but absolutely it's a good parallel, right? To look at how the internet affected, evolved, and apply that to blockchain.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can see here on the slide that some of these authors and commentators about blockchain have really mentioned it talking about it being one of the biggest innovations in computer science, really having that kind of disruptive power. And together we published a white paper just a few weeks ago, and for everyone on the line today, I would encourage you to go to our website, to Bellatrix's website, to have a look at the white paper after this call. But there we argued that blockchain is going to cause major change to businesses, and it's going to lead to the emergence really of new business models. Can you perhaps give us a bit more detail why that is?
Sure. So blockchain, unlike other innovations in technology, and let's use some of the more common recent ones, right? We all hear about the Internet of Things, or we've heard about big data, and we've even heard about AI and how some of those technologies will affect our business operations. Blockchain is quite different in the sense that it is a foundational technology, so it will change the way that economic and social interaction occurs because of the capabilities that are enabled by blockchain. So yeah, I mean that's really probably the good intro answer to that question.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you mentioned that there's kind of that difference between what you mentioned there, like a centralized business versus one which is where you don't perhaps have that centralized business model, where you don't have maybe an intermediary between different users. Can you perhaps explain a bit more about how you see that emerging?
Sure. So as companies are looking at designing their business around this foundational change, the interactions that occur, the way that businesses are designed, need to be actually to operate properly, need to be quite different. So if you folks that are listening, and I'm sure they've read and they hear things like it changes the trust paradigm, and data is immutable, and those types of things. But what gets lost in those conversations is that this is not a technology that is going to be kind of put in place to make things a little better, faster, stronger. What it really does is fundamentally changes the economics of how people interact, right? And historically, our current economy, if you will, is and companies in that economy are built around the idea that we interact with people that we don't know, and so therefore we have to have somebody in the middle to bring trust between two separate parties. And what the blockchain economy will be doing, and what it is doing, is changing that paradigm so that you, as you said, Charles, the idea of a centralized middleman or an aggregation type entity is no longer required, because the software ensures that trust is managed between parties. So what that does is allows you to move to a more democratized, flatter economy in which interactions between parties can go on without major companies and entities in the middle to bring trust. And that will affect everything from banks to data aggregation companies, to insurance companies, to supply chain, to healthcare, to you name it. It's really, it will apply to every manner of economic interaction that we've become used to, actually, for literally thousands of years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think of some of the kind of companies that we think of as being disruptive today, right? When you think about Airbnb or eBay, for example, there's some of these new companies that have really emerged and changed the industries in which they're operating in. What you're saying there, if I understand correctly, is that this new breed of business model is going to actually be disruptive to them. That it's going to be that blockchain is going to do away with these kind of intermediary companies.
Yes, there are already startups that are competing with the likes of Lyft and Uber. I mean, they're not competing if they're not that big, but they will be competing with, right? Because what they've done is, Uber or Lyft is a centralized organization where the folks with the cars are managed through that central organization to the people wanting to ride. And there are blockchain use cases and startups using blockchain where that interaction goes directly through a network that isn't run by a centralized organization, but is run by the network, right? Everybody's a peer in that network, much the way that if folks understand and follow what Bitcoin does, right? That the interaction between those parties occurs in the network, and trust is enforced through the network. And really, think of it like a cooperative almost, right? Where the network is, the users of the network are the owners of the network, and there's no centralized entity that sets the rules, right? In the way that we know it today. Mm-hmm. So yes, those disruptions are coming, and there are people already literally working on disrupting the things that literally just last 24 hours ago seemed to have disrupted the way we think about finding a hotel or finding transportation, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in light of all of this kind of disruptive potential, we're really seeing that big businesses at the moment are investing really heavily in blockchain initiatives. I mean, almost every day we see a press release from a big bank or from a retail company talking about how they are using blockchain, or how they want to start working on a blockchain initiative. Even just this week, for example, I read in the news that an example for that, Samsung, for example, they announced they're going to be building a blockchain-based platform for the Korean government, for the public sector. So do you think these big companies which are now investing, and really making some concrete steps towards blockchain. Do you think they're going to be the winners in this new world?
And so I don't actually. I probably. I think that you could be a winner. I think they could be. I think the challenge is that what is missed in all of these dialogues is these companies, and although I didn't read the release you were talking about specifically, the vast majority of them are looking at existing business models and trying, as I said earlier, to improve the business model. And what they're not doing is saying, how does blockchain render my current way of doing business obsolete, and how do I redesign a business model that works within a blockchain economy? And so what I see in almost every case is technology, perhaps technology-led MVPs or pilots that have evolved to the idea that this way that we currently do business today can be automated almost with blockchain. And what's neglected to be done in there is the idea that the business process that frequently is being automated isn't even required anymore. And so what I do in my consulting and in the work that I do, and I see a lot of this because I'm brought in to help people design a business from kind of you could say the ground up or the top down, right? But it's really a complete business redesign before you even get to the technology. It's like, how do the capabilities that a blockchain environment enables how does it allow me to design a new business, and what would that business look like? And very few people are doing that. I'm very busy, so there are plenty of people doing it, but the vast majority of the things that you read, the banks, those folks, they're just not doing that. They're taking a traditional kind of Gartner hype curve approach, right? Which is get in on the hype, figure out where to apply it, try some things driven by IT, and they're really missing the business redesign. And the reason for that is we've all been trained to think of economics and business interaction the way your average MBA thinks about it, right? It hasn't changed in 3,000 years. And so the idea that it's different is really being led, to finally long-winded answer your question, is really being led by younger and more entrepreneurial or arguably in larger enterprise, separate organizations that are broken out that look at the world and say, I'm not beholden to the numbers on Wall Street. I'm not beholden to the current business processes. And so therefore, I'm going to try to compete in this new economy where I can enable things quite differently than I did before. And the gap between where people are and where they need to be in that thinking is where we all need to be focusing. It is on what does that new world look like, and how do we think in that context, because those are the businesses that will be the winners, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. And related to that, I mean, when you're talking about what this new world is going to look like, we just received a question from the audience, which is what specifically are the banks doing about blockchain? The listener mentioned that it seems that blockchain is eventually going to make them obsolete. So, do you have any insight on what they're doing at the moment?
Well, I do, and what a lot of the organizations are doing are. If you look at the way they're approaching it, it avoids the obsolescence question, right? So the question is the right question, right? Is if you look at what people are doing in a space where one would argue a good business model makes the current model obsolete, that's why an existing company can't make the shift. They can't bring on obsolescence to themselves. It's just not a thing, right? And by the way, it's going to take however long it's going to take to evolve, right? I mean, the world's not going to be in this place where banks are obsolete in 30 years. We'll be in a place where there's serious competition against existing banks and existing insurance companies and all kinds of existing companies. But that's when we'll start to see it, right? We'll start to see it when one of these new business models really gain the type of traction that we expect in innovation. And when that starts to happen, that's when the current companies are going to start to react. And by the way, let me list 2 or 3 representative companies in history that didn't do that and never believed they could be obsolete, right? So Eastman Kodak Company, right? If anybody, I mean, maybe half the folks listening in don't remember film, but the fact is that I actually worked there when digital cameras were coming out, and they just never could believe that it could make them obsolete, and so they didn't really pursue it. And Blockbuster, blah blah blah. I mean, we all know the names, right? There are plenty of names that if you've been in business long enough, you know. But in blockchain, because of the fundamental difference in the way that businesses can operate, it's going to be a much bigger extinction cycle than the few companies we named today that somehow still can make an adaptation. It's a massive change in the way that they think and have to operate. So.
Yeah, and related to that, we have also another comment from a listener that when you're talking about that companies go disappearing and you're cutting out the middlemen, for example, the comment isn't the middleman really a question of trust? It's not really a question of trust, but also there's the benefit of aggregation as well.
Yeah. There is, and that's something you have to, when we start talking about what capabilities. So, we'll use the term that most folks should follow, business architecture, right? Which is the idea of how do I design my business? How do I architect my business? And that's a thing that people don't think strongly of, but in the blockchain move to a blockchain economy, we have to do that. So to answer your question, blockchain enables a dozen or so really strong capabilities that are not available today in the way you think about them. One of them is trust, in the trust interaction. I mentioned immutability, autonomous capabilities, chain of custody type capabilities. And then even if you look at those basic, what I would call the foundational capabilities, they then enable other layers of capabilities that become available, like cryptocurrency, right? So cryptocurrency, and I saw some of the early questions that people were asking around, this session, and Bitcoin comes up a lot because there's a lot of confusion, right? So let me just throw this in here, if you don't mind, Charles, to bring this full circle. Bitcoin is a capability that is enabled by the underlying architecture that is implemented, that is blockchain, implemented through things like Ethereum and other blockchain software, right? So cryptocurrency, which is the outcome of blockchain, right? Or Bitcoin, which is the outcome of blockchain, and other cryptocurrencies, are capabilities that are enabled through blockchain. And you will see other capabilities like identity management, right? So identity, which is a bit of a disaster in our economy, is we all have 100 of them. They're hard to prove. There's big businesses like Know Your Customer and other things that are built around that. Those things will be vastly changed by the capability of identity management that's flowing out of blockchain to be able to be done in a way that the world will accept, where, kind of a centralized authority approach it never could. So to summarize the answer to the question, that these capabilities that are enabled, there's foundational capabilities, and then there's these extension business capabilities that allow you to continue to build on top of the basic idea of a blockchain environment. And through that is where these companies and this innovation will come from. And it's very difficult, as I mentioned, current companies really struggle with the adoption of these other capabilities, because they generally today in the middlemen ecosystem, there's whole companies that exist that enforce the capabilities that blockchain will literally eliminate the whole company, because you just don't have a need for it anymore. It's like trust management. I mean, there are huge companies, their entire premise is you don't trust that other person, so that's why I exist. And blockchain can wipe those out economically by designing a software system that does the same thing.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, if I think, for example, in the case of maybe a travel agency, for example, if you don't have, or if you think about an Airbnb, for example, if you don't have that intermediary, how would I, as an end user, as a customer, how would I actually maybe kind of find the services that I'm looking for in this kind of new world? Is it going to be easier, or is it going to make life harder for me?
Well, the front end, the information ecosystem that's been built with the internet will clearly evolve, and we all know it evolves every day, right? The app on our phones and all those types of things will continue to evolve, but the interface, right, into kind of the underlying processes that make that all work, I'll say will remain substantially the same. What will change is the underlying infrastructure. So if you think about it, right, from an end user's perspective, let's just stick with the Airbnb example, right? You have an app, it happens to be published by Airbnb, that gives you access to their proprietary ecosystem centralized that brings these parties together. In the future, you'll have an app, let's call it Airbnb, right? And it will link to a network of peers, of those offering or houses or rooms or whatever they happen to be, that underlies all that stuff, right? And as a user, you'll connect into that, and the interaction will occur through currencies and value exchange within that ecosystem. But the difference will be that ecosystem won't be, I'll make this up, 30,000 people sitting at companies all over the world that are pushing paper and making processes work, right? It will be somebody saying, I have this thing, it's available, and here's the cost. And somebody else saying, okay, I want it. And the trust piece, do you trust that the money I'm giving you is really going to pay for it? Is the reservation? Do I trust that the person asking for it is who they say they are? Do I trust that the terms and conditions that legally, right, Airbnb kind of manages if something goes sideways, will be managed automatically? And the answer is yes to all of that, right? So all of those things will become automatic mechanisms built through smart contracts and other things on the top of that data set that will effectively do the job of those organizations. So just think, it's a programmed application that does it versus this vast grouping of people. And the reason it can be done is because, again, those basic capabilities, right, which is trust is something in monetary transactions that from the beginning, right, had to have, in order to do a monetary transaction with somebody that you don't trust, you have to do it with somebody you do. So you reach out to somebody you trust, and then the other party trusts them, and they're the middleman, and they pull it together. But when trust is no longer a question or is enforced through smart contracts, you just don't need that anymore. And those are the designs that disrupt those companies and replace them. Again, the front end will look effectively the same, right? But it's the underlying ecosystem that pulls it all together. The peers will interact with each other versus the peers through this very hierarchical based economy of companies that take a slice of everything, right? That's the way that it will evolve.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and kind of taking that kind of idea then, for the executives and for the people listening to this call today, what advice then do you have for those individuals who are just starting out on their blockchain journey?
Well, so I'll say this kind of tongue in cheek, but I am serious, and I think that given today, right? I thought it was funny that today is the day we're having this one. In the last 24 hours, Bitcoin, right, jumped another $1,000 in 24 hours, right? Like it's craziness. And here's what I say. And why am I bringing that up? Because you need to understand the difference between Bitcoin as an implementation of a blockchain architecture and a blockchain-based business, right? Which is the ability to be able to build other businesses on top of this distributed database, for lack of a more short answer for it, right? So you need to start there. You really need to understand that and understand the capabilities that it enables, and do everything you can not to get pulled into the hype of the Ethereum hype or the Hyperledger hype or whatever the application is. It's important, but unlike most innovation that has come along in the last, I'll say certainly in my career in the last 10 or 15 years, in terms of the real kind of hype that's being driven, if you don't look at this from a business, through the business lens, you'll spend a lot of time, forgive me, you'll just spend a lot of time failing. I've been doing this now for about 3.5 years, and I've seen a lot. And what I've seen is companies that don't look at the business design spend a lot of money and they get nowhere. People that look at the business design effectively jump over the hype curve and get right to realizing value. And that's where you need to start. So people that really want to get into this space, they need to really understand it from blockchain up. They need to read a lot, and they need to understand how to think about designing businesses and operating businesses in a ecosystem that is completely different than anything that we've seen in society, really, since the dawn of the exchange of trade, right? It is fundamentally different. And if you go into it with that mindset, it doesn't freak you out. It just, you go, okay, I'm gonna look at it through a lens of a completely different mindset. And I know I'm going to be, seeing the world from a different perspective. Start there and work your way at it from that angle. If you try to learn it and say, how can I apply it to my current business as it's designed, it's really difficult, because that's where, how do I make money? Where do people make money? How do, it doesn't scale. What do you mean it can't do, 500 transactions a second? Like, all of those things matter less, right? When you design your business first, based upon what blockchain enables. So that's what I would tell people. And that's what I tell people every day. That's what I help them do. So.
Okay, excellent. And we have a couple of questions. Actually, really kind of leads on to the next slide. A couple of questions on the chat. Really asking for some concrete examples of what this actually really looks like. And I know we've kind of prepared a couple of examples here for people. About how blockchain is already having an impact on some industries.
Yeah. Absolutely. So in the one we have listed here, peer-to-peer insurance, is one of the simplest ideas is the think of property and casualty insurance. If you kind of rewind back to and there's actually insurance mechanisms still in place like this, but in smaller communities, right? Which is that, insurance is really an investment vehicle. That's really what it is, right? Which is big, large investment companies put forth dollars that cover risk. People pay premiums that cover risk, and all of that money is invested, right? So it's an investment vehicle at the end of the day that hopefully, if everybody does their math right, the investment not only can pay for the risk of people and losses, like your house burning down or your car accident, but then there's a return of some dollars on top of that. And these companies exist literally to manage all of that stuff, right? And so I mentioned institutional investors, which are really the reinsurance side of insurance, right? So think there's institutional investors. You pay your premium, all that money goes into a pot. Hopefully people don't lose more than what goes into the pot plus investment, and people make a nice return. That's insurance, right? Now, in a peer-to-peer economy, right, based upon blockchain, the idea that, maybe you want to invest in building reinsurance pools, and as an individual who doesn't have $500 million or $5 billion to throw towards an investment, right, want to be part of that. And the idea is that money and investment can come from a peer-to-peer network, right? And managed much differently than can be done in these large centralized economies. So on the investment side, I'm already seeing massive changes in the way that insurance is funded, right? So, everything from the idea of ICOs, believe it or not, but also investments, right? Like crowdfunding, that kind of thing. The other side of it, right, which is the actual risk side or the insured side, there is quite a bit of work being done in use cases being tested and built where you've got pools of people that come together, and in the event of a loss, right, then people pay premium, right? So think of it this way, right, which is you quantify an amount of risk for individuals as opposed to people paying premium up front. They pay in the event of losses, right? And so that kind of reverse way of looking at it is another way that blockchain is revolutionizing the insurance industry, right? So it's peer-to-peer, where the peers come together. Again, think crowdfunding, think those kind of things, but that's kind of the high-level model, right? Cross-border payments, remittance, and certainly, Charles, I know, between North and South America, between Africa and other places, between Europe, I mean, remittance and cross-border payments is, there's a lot of money that it costs to do something as simple as sending money from A to Z, right? And a portion of that is the idea of some of the identity problems and other things that go on, but the vast majority of it is organizations just charge 15 or 20% to send money cross-border. And what blockchain allows you to do is build a peer-to-peer, and again, lots of these companies that are spinning up allow you to do peer exchanges between person A and person B in any jurisdiction, and the cost of doing those things is minuscule compared to the way it's done today. And to be honest, hell, you could use Bitcoin, right? Like you can use Bitcoin to send money from A to Z, right? And so it's the same concept. And because it's not a centralized authority, that overhead, that those costs, those takeout, and all the manual processes that are built into the kind of centralized economy get taken out. Trade finance, for folks that might understand the background on that or participate in that, it's another industry that is one of those background things that go on, right? Trade exchange between Asia Pacific and the Americas, and what it costs to finance the shipping and finance the exchange of those goods. It's a very manual, kind of Excel-driven space, and blockchain is a very good solution that is being used to build these peer-to-peer exchanges now for trade finance, and the list goes on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent. I think it provides a lot of color to how blockchain is really impacting several different industries at the moment. But with that, I want to remind everyone and really open up now for some questions from the audience. We've been taking some questions, during the course of today's session, but also just to remind you, please ask questions via the chat box on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, or via Twitter. And we've actually got a few questions already here waiting for you, Tim.
Okay.
And the first one is, what would you have us read to learn more about blockchain?
So, it's funny. I have a list of some really good starting, and unfortunately, it's not a good thing to kind of just rattle off the URLs. I don't know if we can do this, Charles. Is it possible that you guys communicate to the audience after the fact? I can give you a list of some really good, what I give all my clients right before I sit down with them and say, you need to go through these things and understand that. We can send those links out to people if you can do that, and that's probably the best way to answer that question.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we can send that after the call. Yeah. Okay.
I'll just say to verbally answer the one thing, if you don't want to wait for that. Alan Tapscott is a name that some folks, and Don Tapscott are names that you might recognize. Don Tapscott has a TED Talk that is easy to find. It's T-A-P-P-S-C-O-T. I think it's double T on the end, Don. And it's a TED Talk. It's a YouTube video. It's one of the better, excellent. I think it's from this summer, one of the summers. It might be this summer or last summer. So it's 16 or 17, but it's spectacular. And it's a really good starting point. So, if you find yourself wanting to not wait for that, just do a quick Google on Don Tapscott, TED Talk on blockchain, and it's very good. He does a very, very good job at it. It's typical 20-minute and he explains all of what we've been talking about in kind of beginner entry level terms. So it's very good.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. We have another question regarding news and the publishing industry. Could you envision a blockchain approach where each journalist effectively becomes their own trusted entity in the chain? This could eliminate the need for many current media companies.
So, yes. And I think whoever's idea that is, I'll just say, hey, you should chase that, because I do believe that. It is actually one that I, as you can tell by my accent, I'm a American, U.S. North American guy, right? So just certainly in the age that we're in right now, that question is at the top of my head, and I just want to see pursuit of how to manage this type of trusted environment that will allow the exchange of articles and stories and payment. And I think that when I take it a bit farther, and I say, yes, those media companies, not because they're not producing good content, but there's always questions about the content. And so, immutability and history and all of the stuff that comes with blockchain, as well as an ecosystem of value exchange, could absolutely revolutionize the way that today, right? If you think what the internet has done to media, I think blockchain is going to take it the rest of the way. And I think because you have people producing content, but the problem is that the people who produce that content, it's questionable. That's number one. So how do you solve that problem? Number two, they don't get paid for it, right? And so I think we're going to see the final evolution through media to a place where it's a peer-to-peer exchange, where trust is managed, where the payment of the content and the value that's created gets managed. And I think blockchain can take us there. So yes, I absolutely think it. And like I said, I think that the person who asked the question should run with that one. So
okay,
I would encourage it.
Yeah, someone's just asking us about the name of that TED talk. Could you just repeat the name?
The TED talk is like Intro to Blockchain, but it's Don Tapscott is the.
Okay, well, we'll include that in the follow-up as well. And we have one last question as well about initial coin offerings, which have been in the news a lot recently. What's your take on them, and should businesses be concerned?
So I think that I think that ICOs and initial coin offerings are a great idea. How I help people design ICOs and design businesses with effectively tokens is that what you ask yourself is, does the business need a value exchange internally, or does the business model fall apart if you don't have a value token that allows you to interact in between the peer entities, right? And if the answer is no, it doesn't need it, then it's generally somebody who's just trying to get on the bandwagon. But there are lots of really good business models being designed where tokens, right, of which the ICOs are the kind of starting point for the launch of that within the business, are being used to generate really fascinating business models and where value creation and value exchange is managed through that token, right? And so people invest in that token saying, if the network increases in value, then the token increases in value. And if the token increases in value, then I make some money, right? And it isn't, I mean, from the SEC's perspective, they don't look at it, I should say, people who do it don't look at it as an investment vehicle because it passes the tests that allow you to not consider it an equity, right? And there's so to the questioner's question, right? The jury is out on how governments and the SEC and all that are going to react to that. But I believe what's going to, my gut tells me, is that they're going to draw the line and say, okay, there's two types of tokens, those which break the rules and those that don't. And if you're on those that don't side, think you're fine, right? I think you're fine, and I think that train is out of the station, and it's so far out of the station that how it gets reeled in or managed, I think the lines are going to be drawn between entities that are doing it because it's a legitimate part of their business model and those that are not. So if you ask yourself that question, you can find ICOs that are very good. And there's, again, maybe because it's just off the top of my head, Charles, I'll give, so as a follow-up, right, we'll list 2 or 3 good ICO white papers that I encourage people to read to understand it, not as a, again, we're not recommending whether people invest or do any of that. I stay out of that business. But just really good white papers that outline how ICOs are being used. And they're great to read because usually they're very easy to understand and they really help you get your head around how good companies are using them. So we'll include a couple links to like 2 or 3 that I'm thinking of that that I follow, right, or have read. So
okay, excellent.
I hope that helps with that question.
Okay, excellent. I know we've gone over the time a little bit. Do you have a few? We've got couple more questions waiting, Tim. Do you have a few more minutes to stick around?
Absolutely.
Okay,
sure,
excellent.
absolutely.
Next question is, can you describe a bit the difference between public and private blockchains? Perhaps give some examples of how each one should be used.
Sure. The easiest thing to think about is equate it to the difference between a public and private network, right? So intranet versus internet, right? So the basic idea is the same, and that's the way you should look at it through that lens to just kind of put it in the right bucket. Now, there's a lot of people that would say that if you're using blockchain and it's not public, then you shouldn't be using blockchain. And I don't agree with that. There are lots of cases where a private side makes sense, and maybe it only makes sense for the next 20 or 50 years, but it makes sense, right? Healthcare is a really good example, right? Blockchain can bring a whole lot to healthcare, but nobody is going to put personal health information on a public blockchain, even if you design it in a way where some portion of it is locked and encrypted versus not. Like I just don't. I think there's too much to the evolution of people's mindsets to get there. So so to answer the fundamental question, use cases where there is information that just either it's not appropriate to make it public, but it needs to be shared between trusted entities. You can absolutely design business models with private blockchains around that. By the way, I'm a big believer in transparency. So people would argue that private blockchains diminish blockchain's value because blockchain is about transparency. It's about democratization and flattening the playing field and bringing the unbanked and the extreme poor into our economy and solving all those problems. And I agree that I love that and I'm all for it. But I also know that it's an evolution and it's although Bitcoin might be wide open from a transparency perspective, not everything is going to take that path, right? So you really have to ask those questions and think about it this way. Like any other data question, you have to sit down and design your data model for blockchain. And when you do that, right, that's when you end up with the answer to, does this really belong on a public chain or not, right? And can I put something there? Should I put something there? Versus is this just a closed ecosystem in which all the information will be on a private chain, right? So.
Okay, excellent. We have one last question, which is that blockchain seems to be a great way to hide identity. You see hackers, for example, using Bitcoin. So does it really give trust?
Well, so I guess here's what I would ask the following question, right? Is it depends what trust question you're asking, and part of the kind of when you really get into the design of future businesses and the like, you have to ask yourself the following question, right? Why is knowing who did a transaction important? And what I mean by that is we have designed an economy in which anonymity versus, the idea of anonymity is a bad thing, because the economy has to know things in order to do certain tasks. And in the blockchain economy, you don't have to know those things to do those tasks. So to just include them, because that's the way we've always done it, is a bad design always, right? So you have to ask yourself the following question. What trust question are you asking, right? So if you say, I don't trust somebody who's anonymous, then you should, whoever that person is, should say to themselves, I'm never going to take cash ever again, right? Because there's no difference, right? Like, there's no difference in that sense. So you really have to start slicing it up and going, well, why am I asking that question? You have to break it down at each level question. So do I trust that the transaction will go through and I will get my money? Like, that's an important trust question, right? And that's the one that people, when they talk about trust, they're talking about trust of the network executing on the transaction and that you won't lose your money, right? That's a piece of trust that's really important to people, is not losing their money. Then there's a separate trust question, right? Which is, do I need to know who that person is? Do I really care? Or, and the answer is sometimes, and know your customer and terrorism and things like that, the answer is yes. But there are other ways to solve those problems, right? And so I hope that answers the question. Just break it down and ask each question and say, why am I asking the question? And what trust question am I asking? And then you realize it's not one, it's 50 questions that we throw all into one bucket, and you need to break it apart as you're designing your new business model, question by question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Tim.
Sure.
And I think actually we've covered all the questions from the audience, so I think it's a good time to bring this to a close. And firstly, I'd like to say thank you to the audience, really, for joining us today and for all your great questions, making it very interactive. So thank you for your participation, and thank you, Tim, for joining us today. It's been absolutely great to get your insights and your expertise on the topic. So thank you very much for joining us today. Yeah. I should also mention everyone.
Absolutely. Sorry, go ahead.
Just want to say that we will be posting a recording of this session within the next 24 hours as well. And Tim, do you want to leave the audience with some final thoughts?
I'm sorry?
Do you want to leave some final thoughts for the audience?
Yes, sorry. Somebody walked into my conference room right as you said that question. So, yeah, I mean, final thoughts are that it's an exciting time, and where we are in kind of the value economy that blockchain is enabling is akin to, as I mentioned earlier, at day one of the internet, right? And we have a unique ability here, which is we all just kind of live through a cycle, and we're starting to see another cycle that will change fundamentally the way that we all interact. And so my parting thoughts are, it's fun. It's a great time to be looking at and learning, and it's just a fun topic, right? Because it's got a very creative thread to it. And so I encourage as many people that want is to learn it, understand what it's going to mean to them, and get ahead of it, right? And get on par with it, because it will affect all of us. And the kind of parting thought is that for those that, I think it's incumbent on all of us to design an economy that we're doing consciously that really does achieve the goals that, some of the early Bitcoin adopters put forth, which is bringing more people into the fold and and so don't forget the people who aren't coming along, and figure out how they take part in this new economy we're designing. I highly encourage people to do that. So.
Okay, and I should mention to everyone, if you have any follow-up questions, anything we didn't cover, we will be sending our contact details together with the follow-up and together with a link to recording as well. So please do feel free to reach out either to myself or to Tim to continue the conversation. And with that, I'd like to say thanks once again, and have a great rest of the day.
Great. Thanks, Charles. Thank you, everybody.